Good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. Glad you're out. I hope you had a better week than I did. I appreciate, I've had several phone calls and cards in the mail and text messages and all kinds of stuff. I appreciate all of that. I am on the mend. I am getting better, but it's still not well and probably won't be for a while. We are in Ezekiel Chapter 30. Ezekiel Chapter 30 is where we pick up this morning as we continue our study of the book of Ezekiel. We are in the middle of a section of Scripture that is talking about prophecies about Egypt. Israel and Egypt had a kind of a close relationship for a long time. Of course, we're all familiar with the fact that the nation of Israel was actually born or began in Egypt. Joseph's family, Jacob's family, went down to Egypt and stayed for about 400-something years. They were slaves for a while. They were brought out of Egypt by the power of God through Moses. They moved into the land of Canaan, and because of the proximity of Egypt and Israel, they had a continuing relationship. Sometimes they were enemies, sometimes they were friends, sometimes they were both. The biggest issue that occurred between Egypt and Israel is that almost every time that Israel turned to Egypt for help, Egypt would say yes and then would fail to show up. In the context, what we're talking about here in chapter 30 is exactly what happened this time. Israel was under threat from Babylon. Israel turned to Egypt for help, and Egypt didn't show up. Which part of the issue with that is Israel was told from the very, very beginning not to turn to Egypt for help. In fact, they weren't supposed to turn to any foreign nation for help. They were supposed to turn to God. But Egypt was not a very good friend or helper. Now, chapter 30 is the second of these chapters that talks about Egypt. And he talks about the fact that their punishment, their judgment is coming. Notice he begins, turn the page too early. He begins the chapter, the word of the Lord came unto me, Son of man, prophesy and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Well, alas for the day is near, the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. A sword shall come upon Egypt, and anguish shall be in Cush, when the slain fall in Egypt, and her wealth is carried away, and her foundations are torn down. Cush and Put and Lud and all Arabia and Libya, and the people of the land that is in league shall fall with them by the sword. God here makes a prophecy regarding the nation of Egypt. And he begins by talking about the fact that the day of the Lord is near. We've talked on several occasions about the fact that that phrase, day of the Lord, is used in two different senses. It's used in a sense of judgment. The day of the Lord is near in the sense that judgment is coming. That's the sense it's used here. The day of the Lord is coming. The day of judgment on Egypt is coming. It's also used in the sense of a day of celebration or a day of greatness. The day of the Lord can be that. An example of that would be the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost was a day of the Lord, but it was a day of celebration. It was a day of greatness. It was not a day of judgment. And so it's used in those two different senses. In this context, it's used in the sense of judgment. He tells you that when he says it will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nation. This is a time of judgment. This is a time of doom. This is not a time of celebration or greatness. And he said it will be a day of clouds. Clouds are generally the precursor of storms. And so that's what he's talking. When he talks about it being a day of clouds, that's what it's a reference to. It's a reference to the clouds are coming, which means the storms are coming. The judgment is coming. A sword shall come upon Egypt. The anguish shall be in Cush. What is Cush? It's another name for Ethiopia. It's one of those nations that were around Egypt. In the next couple of verses, notice down in verse 5, Cush and Put and Lud and Arabia and Libya. Those nations were nations that were around Egypt, and they were nations that were in league with or affiliation with Egypt. To give you just to kind of put this in a way that we can understand, let me suppose, just for the sake of argument, that next week, and I don't think this is going to happen, and it's probably not, and I'm pretty sure it won't, but let's say next week, the United States government collapses. Is that going to affect more than just us? It's going to affect a lot of nations, isn't it? There are a lot of nations that are in league, that are in affiliation with the United States. They're going to be affected if that were to happen. And so that's what he's talking about with Egypt. All these nations around Egypt that depended on Egypt for commerce, that depended on Egypt for protection, that depended on Egypt for affiliation, they're going to be affected by Egypt's destruction. There's one interesting statement there. He says, Cush and Put and Lud and all Arabia and Libya and the people of the land that is in league. The people of what land? One translation says, instead of the people of the land, it says the people of the covenant. Who are the people of the covenant? Israel. When Babylon took the city of Jerusalem, remember the Babylonian army left that Babylonian governor there. You remember what happened to that Babylonian governor? He was murdered by a group of Jews. What did those group of Jews then do? They ran to Egypt. And they took Jeremiah with them. And so now you've got, in about 580, you've got a colony of Jews in Egypt. And what he talks about, he talks in that verse about the people of the land that is in league, or the people of the covenant. He's talking about those Jews that are in Egypt. They're going to be affected by the fall of Egypt because they're living in Egypt. They're depending upon the Egyptian government. And so you've got some individuals who are Jews, even though they may not be faithful Jews, who are going to be affected by this issue. Thus says the Lord, those who support Egypt shall fall, and her proud might shall come down from Migdol to Syene. They shall fall within her by the sword, and declares the Lord, they shall be desolated in the midst of the desolated countries. Their cities shall be in the midst of cities that are laid waste. They will know that I am the Lord whom I have set when I have set fire to Egypt, and all her helpers are broken. There are a lot of people who want to look and say, this talks about destruction in Egypt. And there's no record in history of any destruction in Egypt, so it must not have happened. How do you answer that?
They didn't write it down.
They didn't write it down. We've talked before about the fact historians in that day and age were not historians to record history as it happened. They were historians who were paid by the king. And so when something bad happened, they just simply ignored it. There is no record in Egyptian history of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea on dry ground and Pharaoh's army drowning. That's not recorded in Egyptian history. Now, in our modern day era, we don't operate that way. Historians are people who write history as it happens, good or bad. They didn't do that. They only wrote the good stuff and they left out the bad stuff. So the destruction and devastation that came to Egypt at this time simply would not have been recorded, and other nations were not writing about or interested in the history of Egypt. The historians of Egypt only wrote about Egypt. The historians of Babylon only wrote about Babylon. The historians of Assyria only wrote about Assyria. There wasn't any such thing as world history being recorded, or some person or group of people sitting down and writing, this is what happened. It just didn't happen.
I guess until Josephus, it just didn't happen. Because he records everything that happened to Israel, and Judah.
He goes all the way back to, if I'm not mistaken, Josephus goes all the way back to creation. But it is, for Josephus, even in that instance, it's a record of the Jewish people. It's not a record of the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire, only as they interacted with Israel. So if you want to find out about what happened to the Jewish people, you can read Josephus. I was very lucky, about 25 years ago, somebody gave me there are 5 books, and somebody gave me a complete set of the works of Josephus. I have them. I've glanced at them. I've read some of them. I haven't taken the time to read all 5 of them. But it's a very interesting proposition. But anyway, historians in that day and age were paid by the king to record what the king wanted recorded. On that day, messengers shall go out from me in ships to terrify the unsuspecting people of Cush, and anguish shall come upon them on the day of Egypt's doom. Behold, it comes. Again, you've got the idea of word getting to Cush about Egypt's fall. You have to remember, in our modern day age, if something happens and 10 minutes later, it's on the internet. It's all over the world. Things in that day and age traveled by word of mouth. And how fast they traveled oftentimes depended on how much interaction there was between, as close as Israel and Egypt were, that their information would have gone for that day and age relatively quickly. But information between Egypt and Babylon may have taken a while. Or information between Egypt and Assyria may have taken a while, because you've got quite a long journey there. And there's not a lot of daily interaction. But he says, word's going to come to Cush. I meant to mention, and I passed it, verse 8, we've talked about this on several occasions. There is probably the most repeated statement in all of Ezekiel. They will know that I am the Lord. Oh, how many times? I think somebody said 51 times. That's found in the book of Ezekiel. A lot of what God does is to show people who He is. A lot of what God did throughout history to show people who He is, so that people understand who God is. I will put an end to the wealth of Egypt by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He and his people with him, the most ruthless of nations, shall be brought in to destroy the land. They shall draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain. Babylon was, as far as armies go, probably one of the most ruthless armies that ever existed. Their intent was to destroy the enemy. And anybody who wasn't Babylonian and who wasn't working for and supporting the Babylonian government was the enemy. It didn't matter whether you were 6 months old or 110 years old. You were the enemy. And when they went to attack a city, when they went to take a city, there was no such thing as mercy. There was no such thing as leaving certain people alone. It was utter annihilation and utter destruction. And when Babylon was eventually judged by God and punished themselves, one of the things God accused Babylon of was being merciless and cruel and harsh. Now I hear a lot of people today talking about fighting a humane war. I don't believe there is any such thing. War is not humane. But there are extremes to which you can go. Most civilized countries won't attack a hospital. Notice I said most, I didn't say all. Most. Because there are limits to what they believe ought to be conducted as far as war is concerned. Babylon had none of those limits. It didn't matter. If they were attacking Israel and you belonged to Israel, you were a target. To destroy Egypt's wealth, destroy the land, that shall draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain. I will dry up the Nile, and I will sell the land into the hand of evildoers. I will bring desolation upon the land and everything in it by the hand of foreigners. I am the Lord, I have spoken. If you know anything about Egypt, you know the Nile River is the lifeline for the land of Egypt. And a lot of what propelled the nation of Egypt in ancient times with their agriculture and their prosperity was, off of the Nile River, they would build canals. They would use those canals to irrigate their farmland so they could grow crops. When the Nile River was low, when there wasn't a lot of water in the Nile River, Egypt was in trouble. Those canals were very useful. They were great for the land of Egypt. The problem is canals require maintenance. If you don't maintain them, if you don't keep them cleaned out, they clog up. And so when Egypt is attacked, when Egypt is overtaken, their main concern during war is not those canals. Their main concern is their protection. They're fighting a war. And so those canals would have probably been ignored. And it may very well be that's what he's talking about when he says, I will dry up the Nile. Those canals that provided water for the agriculture, that provided water for people, that provided drinking water and cleaning water, and all the water the people needed came from that Nile River. And if those canals got clogged up, or if there was a drought, and the Nile River was low, was not what it should have been. We don't have that kind of climate in our world, in our part of the world. But in that part of the world, there were what were referred to as dry seasons and rainy seasons. There were certain times of the year in Israel it never rained, ever. And there were certain times of the year when it seemed to rain all the time. They were called the dry season and the rainy season. The rainy season, the Nile River would flood. It would overflow. You'd get a lot of extra water that you could use. When it got dry, if there was a drought, and that, if it doesn't rain in March or April here, we can wait till May. But over there, if it didn't rain, when they first planted crops, it rained. It didn't rain again until harvest time. They went 3, 4, 5, 6 months without a drop. That's just their climate. So if that rainy season did not come, they didn't have a crop because they didn't have water. The second rainy season usually happened just around harvest time. And if that didn't come, they didn't harvest crops because they'd all die. So that rainy season was vitally important for their agriculture and for their sustenance and for their life. When it didn't happen, it really caused issues. When the Nile dried up, when the Nile was low, when those canals were stopped up, it caused a great deal of problems for Egypt. I will bring desolation upon the land and everything in it by the hand of foreigners. I am the Lord, I have spoken. Now, one thing you have to remember, in our modern day world, most of us are not farmers. There are a few of us who may have a garden, who grow a few vegetables or things like that. Most of us do not depend on farming for a living. In ancient Israel and Egypt, almost everybody farmed. It was an agricultural society. Now, we still depend on agriculture, but we don't live in an agricultural society. We live in an industrial society. Most of us have jobs that are not connected to agriculture. That was not the case in Egypt and Israel. Almost everybody, even people who were, let's say you had a person who was a blacksmith or a person who owned a store, even those people still had farms because they grew their own crops. They grew their own food. One of the things my dad always talked about, my dad grew up in the middle of the Depression, born in 1925. He said, I wore overalls that had holes in them. They called them Hooveralls, because Hoover was president. Most of the fall, most of the summertime, I went barefoot. I didn't know what a toy was. Because I never in my life went hungry. Because we grew our own food. We had chickens. We had cows. Grandma had a big garden in the backyard. They were cotton farmers, so they grew a lot of cotton. He said, we never went without food. We always ate. And so they were very dependent upon that, and when the Nile didn't work, they were in trouble. It doesn't matter how big your military is, or how powerful your army is, or how great your government you've got, or how much money you've got, if you ain't got no food. Well, then you'll starve to death. I will destroy the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis. They shall no longer be a prince among the land of Egypt. I will put fear in the land of Egypt. I will make Pathros a desolation. Will set fire to Zoan. Will execute judgment on Thebes. By the way, all of these names that are mentioned here are the major cities that existed in Egypt. And he starts out by talking about the idolatry. Egypt was, you remember in Acts 17 when Paul went to Athens and he went to Mars Hill and he talked about the altar to the unknown God? That was Egypt in Israel's time. Egypt worshipped over 125 different deities. There were all kinds of different gods and all kinds of different goddesses and all kinds of different statues, and they were all over the place. I will make Pathros a desolation, will set fire to Zoan, will execute judgment on Thebes. I will pour out my wrath on Pelusium, the stronghold of Egypt, and cut off the multitude of Thebes. I will set fire to Egypt. Pelusium shall be in great agony. Thebes shall be breached, and Memphis shall face enemies by day. The young of On and of Pabeseth shall fall by the sword. Women shall go into captivity at Tephaphanes. The day shall be dark when I break there the yoke bars of Egypt. By the way, if you can pronounce these names better than I can, you go right ahead. Her proud might shall come to an end, and her shall be covered by a cloud. Her daughters shall go into captivity. I will execute judgments on Egypt. They will know that I am the Lord. There again is that phrase. In the 11th month, in the first month, on the second day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man. This is another speech given about Egypt. I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Behold, it has not been bound up to heel, by binding it with a bandage, so that it may become strong to wield the sword. If you are a swordsman, if you fight with a sword, and they break this arm, and they don't put a cast on it, or they don't wrap it somehow, are you going to be able to use a sword? That arm becomes pretty much useless. So he's talking about the futility of Egypt's army. I am against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and will break his arms, both the strong one and the one that is broken. And I will make the sword fall from his hand. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the countries. I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put my sword in his hand. will break the arms of Pharaoh, and he will groan before him like a man mortally wounded. Not only is he going to weaken Egypt, he's going to strengthen Babylon. It's bad enough when God's against you. But when God's against you and God is for your enemy, he's not just weakening Egypt. He's weakening Egypt and he's strengthening Babylon. So he's doing both. Now, I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon, but the arms of Pharaoh shall fall. They shall know that I am the Lord when I put my sword in the hand of the king of Babylon. He stretches it out against the land of Egypt. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations, disperse them throughout the countries. They will know that I am the Lord. Evidently, there was about a 40-year period between the time Nebuchadnezzar took Egypt and the time that Cyrus became king in about 536, the Medo-Persian king, when he allowed all the people, remember he allowed the Jews to go back home? He allowed all conquered nations to go back home. And at that point, those Jews who had been taken captive and carried elsewhere were also allowed to go back home. We're going to get into this a little bit later in the next couple of chapters. But the fact of the matter is, this point, when Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt, that point was the end of Egypt's reign as a world power. They were never again a great nation. Never again a great nation ruled by their own people. Everybody thinks about the height of Egypt being during Cleopatra. That actually wasn't the case. Second thing you got to consider, Cleopatra was not an Egyptian. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. She was a descendant of one of the generals of Alexander the Great. She was not an Egyptian. At that point, Egypt was not ruling. Egyptians were not ruling Egypt. Foreigners were. And so Egypt's long reign, you think about it, you go all the way back to Pharaoh, and back to Moses, and even before Moses. Egypt had been a great world power for hundreds of years, maybe even more than 1,000 years. And at this point, it's done. And Egypt has never again, even to this day, Egypt has never again been a great world power. Anyone have a question or comment on anything in chapter 30? If not, I'm done.